Hello, everyone. This is Small Town Voice. I recently had a conversation with Mr. Gonzalo Lira. For those of you who don't know who he is, Mr. Gonzalo Lira is an American novelist and filmmaker. His works include Counterparts, Dome Rastri, which is in Spanish, and Acrobat, which was later made into a movie. Mr. Lira also contributed economic analysis to Zero Hedge, Naked Capitalism, and The Business Insider. Currently, Mr. Lira is situated in Ukraine and is informing the world about the ongoing Ukraine conflict through his own eyes. We talked about three things. One is he gave me the latest update about Ukraine war and explained why Bakhmut is an important city. And the second thing we talked about is why Europeans hate Russian. I find that's very fascinating. And then the third one is de-dollarization. What does it mean for the world and for the United States? So these are the things we talked about, and I find the conversation with him very interesting and very insightful. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So here it is. So let's start. Now, my first question would be for you, since you are inside Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So what is the latest? Can you give us some update? In particular, what is the significance of this Bakhmut? Why is it so important?
Well, Bakhmut originally was important because it was the second major defensive line of the Kiev regime insofar as holding back the advance of the Russian armies. And what the Russian armies basically did was they have turned this conflict into a war of attrition. A war of attrition is, of course, just trying to grind down the enemy forces. Many people think that it's like a one-to-one ratio. No, the idea of an attritional warfare is economy of force. Lose as few people as possible on your side and inflict the maximum damage on the opposing side. And so the first instance of industrial warfare that used an attrition strategy was the American Civil War in the mid-19th century. And the best strategy insofar as an attritional war to defend is to constantly pull your army away and have the aggressor chase you, which is what happened in the American Civil War. Excuse me. And so what happens is that, but the worst way is to just crash two opposing armies, just crash and create trenches and fight that way, which is what has happened in this conflict. This happened, of course, in the First World War, famously with the trench warfare. Now, what has happened in this conflict is that the Russians are much superior insofar as their basic tactics and operational approach to attritional warfare. What they've been doing is they don't send waves of troops. What they do is that they fire artillery to destroy the Kiev regime forces. And once they have sufficiently denigrated those opposing forces, only then do they send in soldiers to sort of mop up and take over, okay? Now, this strategy for the Russian side has been extremely effective. They've inflicted tremendous losses on the Kiev regime. The current estimates are varied, but it is estimated that the Kiev regime has lost between 175,000 to over 200,000 killed in action, which is a catastrophic number. And insofar as the Russian side is concerned, most analysts agree with numbers that have been researched by the BBC and Mediazona that put the total combined Russian losses, that is, Russian armed forces, Wagner, LPR, DPR, and Chechen forces, at under 20,000. So as you can see, it's a lopsided number. It's roughly 8-1. So on the one hand, the Russians are destroying the Kiev regime forces, and on the other, not only are they destroying them in such a lopsided number of 8-1, but the Russians themselves have so much more in reserve. So the outcome of this conflict is not in doubt. It has not been in doubt for quite some time, and especially as of now. Now, Bakhmut, to go back to your question, is important because it was a transportation hub, because in and of itself, the town of Bakhmut is relatively small. Before the war, it was about 75,000 people, but multiple roads and multiple rail lines crossed through it. And that's why it became originally a very important hub in the defensive line of the Kiev regime, so they could move material and equipment back and forth. But what has happened is that it has now become a political objective because the Kiev regime put so many forces to defend the city and lost so many. It's estimated that in the month of February, they lost upwards of 11,000 men in just that city. And so what has happened is that, it's like a bad gambler. He keeps betting on red, thinking that this time it'll turn out a winner, but he loses, so he puts even more chips on red and more and more and more. And that's what's happened to the Kiev regime. They have bet so much on Bakhmut that they can't give it up. And so that's why the fighting is so fierce there. And that's why it is the largest battle of this entire conflict, much larger than Mariupol, and the largest single battle probably since the Korean War, quite frankly, because it has been incredible, the kind of men who have been killed and wounded, and the amount of materiel that has been destroyed in this single battle. So yeah, it's going to keep on going, and the Kiev regime is preparing an offensive that they've been announcing quite some time now. And you see, the Kiev regime has to defend Bakhmut because they've invested so much. And so there's the notion that they're going to go on a counteroffensive on Bakhmut, but the Russians are prepared. So those men who go into this counteroffensive, they might be able to bend the Russian lines, certainly, and make the Russians retreat. But the Russians in this entire conflict have shown themselves more than happy to give up terrain in order to conserve their forces. And so if the Kiev regime were to counterattack on Bakhmut and perhaps even take it back, it would not matter, because for the Russians, this war is not about territory. It's about diminishing the Kiev regime forces, which they are accomplishing. And so if they have to give up some land in order to achieve that goal of diminishing Kiev regime forces, they're happy to do so. They've done it before. And so this war the outcome is inevitable. The Russians will win this conflict. And this offensive that the Kiev regime is planning, because this offensive is not just in Bakhmut, but also in Zaporozhye, it looks like the last roll of the dice for the Kiev regime. And they will probably lose rather catastrophically. And it's terrible because they should be negotiating peace, but instead they continue with this war that they cannot win. It's just mathematically not possible. And for the Russians, of course, this is existential. So they are going to use every effort and every means necessary to win this conflict. So that's where we stand at this time.
Now, do you think once they lose Bakhmut, do you think that will be the end of the war?
Possibly, okay. But we won't know. You see, you have to look back on the First World War when the Imperial Germany was fighting the Allies. They kept on fighting and fighting and fighting, and then all of a sudden they collapsed. And that's usually what happens in attritional warfare. You have the side that is losing, it continues to fight to the very end. In fact, in the American Civil War that I mentioned before, the Confederates actually won the last 2 or 3 battles of the Civil War. But what happens in attrition, it's basically the army gets to a point of being so weak that it just collapses. It does not have the ability to continue fighting. When that moment is reached cannot really be predicted. After the fact, many times you can see, oh yeah, that was the moment, that was the end. But while it's happening, you have to wait and see. The outcome is not in doubt. It's like, to put it to you in a simple way, I don't know when it's going to rain, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but I know it will rain at some point. Okay, it's inevitable. And so that's where the stage we're in. We don't know when it will end, but we do know that it will end, and we know more or less how it will end. And how it will end, of course, is that the Kiev regime forces will simply collapse because their losses have been too high and they cannot sustain military operations anymore.
Okay. I have another question is for Ukraine, for this country, Ukraine. And for the people, regular people, Ukrainians who are living in Ukraine, is it better that they have their own country, Ukraine, or is it better they're part of Russia? This country is fairly new, right? They only existed for 30 years. And for 30 years, I think the total count is they had 18 presidents. Seems to me
Well,
very
yeah,
unstable.
Yeah, the reason it's so unstable is because there are essentially two large ethnic groups in Ukraine since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There is in the south and the east ethnic Russians who speak Russian.
Okay.
And then there's the central and western areas, which are ethnically Ukrainian, although many of them, if not most of them, speak Russian as their first language. Okay. And so there's always been this ethnic divide. Also, what happens is the East and the South is more industrial and richer because of it. And also the best farmland is in the East and the South. The famous black soil earth of Ukraine, it's there in the East and the South, which is precisely the area that is ethnically Russian. And so the ethnic Russians feel that they have not had a political voice. They feel that they have been taken advantage of by Kiev because of high taxes and other financial issues. And so there's always been this tension within the country because it is not ethnically unified. And the ethnic Russian minority, but it's a very slight minority. It's like 45%. You know, it creates this tension of like almost like a civil war. Now, if you were to ask the ethnic Russians, would they prefer to be part of the Russian Federation? Most certainly. You know, the areas that were annexed by Russia, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Lugansk, and Donetsk, they voted overwhelmingly to join the Russian Federation because they are Russian. They are ethnic Russian. And over the past 8 years, they have been consistently being shelled and attacked by the Kiev regime. And so they, of course, want to join the Russian Federation. Other areas of Ukraine, you'd have to look at each individual area. But the five that Russia now controls, which is Crimea, Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, they all want to be part of Russia, and they are part of Russia, and they're never going to leave Russia at this point. I mean, it's already signed, sealed, and delivered. But the other areas that are predominantly Russian, like Kharkov, where I am located, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro, as it's currently called, yeah, those will likely, I think, will likely become part of the Russian Federation. Because I do believe that in this conflict, since the Kiev regime refuses to negotiate because of the Western powers that control the Kiev regime, that they're going to have to fight to the bitter end. And once that happens, it's very clear that the Russians are going to physically take possession of the entire country, and they will likely dismember it. And the parts that are ethnically Russian, predominantly ethnic Russian, which is, as I said before, the East and the South, Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkov, they will go to the Russian Federation. That's my thinking at this time.
Then the Ukraine part of it, they would be more independent? Is that?
I think that it'll become like a independent state called Ukraine that will be landlocked without any outlet to the sea. And I think it will probably be controlled by a government that is extremely friendly to the Russians. I mean, extremely friendly to the Russians. And certainly NATO will not be allowed into this rump Ukraine state. That's what I think will happen.